Today marks the 6th anniversary of my first album, titled Crystal Skins and Cardinal Sins. It's a 13-song, 53-minute album. It consists of ambient bass tracks and some dance tracks that mark the end of the beginning of my producing career. This album came out in 2018, pretty much months after I graduated, in December, of course. I'd gotten Ableton only like 2 years ago at 16, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. I remember at the beginning, I was just working day in, day out, like trying to learn this new program, trying to learn music production and music writing in general. I used to just ignore schoolwork. I'd just like stay up all night and work in class on these songs. And I'd post a lot of it on SoundCloud, just remixes of popular songs of friends I found online and really amateur singles. After high school, I'd get a job working overnight at Walmart, just stocking shelves. I'd never gotten a job before this, and I was also going through some really weird stuff, some weird personal stuff. All this combined was taking a toll on my mental health. It was also dwindling the very few social connections I had in my life. I had a lot of downtime on my hands. This job wasn't something that was like you needed to give a lot of thought or attention to. You just stock shelves. So I just got to thinking like a lot. And I remember clear as day, I was in the paint section because they put me in hardware a lot. And I just wanted to start an album. Somehow the phrase Cardinal Sin kept popping up in my head. It kind of fit with the way I was uneducated with my production skills, that I'd just go off the cuff with a lot of decisions in my music making abilities. So obviously I'd choose Cardinal Sin, and somehow Crystal Skins had coincided with that. I like alliteration a lot, so that was something that that just fit really well. I think I had this idea that crystals have rough exteriors, but they can also be made into really good works of art for what we determine as works of art. Let's see what I wrote down here. The crystal, for all intents and purposes, is unrefined beauty, something that is, at the time, what I was aspiring to be. I then came up with this narrative of a man who found this great ancient power in a crystal cave. Later on in the story would find out that these powers are too grand, the consequences are too great, and he would denounce it at the end. But I don't think that really came through in the album, mainly because my own life powered through it. Also, it's hard to tell a story through an instrumental. It's just an interesting thought to have while you're listening to the album. After that night thinking about the album, though, I had gotten to work on the first song already. Confrontation Feedback was the result of everything I had put into my head so far, directly put into a DAW. At that point, anything I thought of really didn't translate into a program really well. For anyone who creates, to be able to do that is like a really big feat for what you're envisioning in your head to go out into your project. I had used feedbacks of crystal sounds. I had spectral wavetables of shimmering pads, and I even had actual speaker feedback for that little bass line. I had it pretty much set in stone after I created that song that I wanted to make an album, so the momentum there was pretty grand from the start. But of course, the rest of the album wasn't so cut and dry. Personal issues kept coming up. I'd quit my job. Something really traumatic in my life happened right after, and then I'd had to get another job just to sustain myself and finish this album. Despite that, I was still hacking away at this thing like piece by piece, for the most part. Songs like Artificial Dances were made beforehand. I had actually made that in English class, the one that I was probably going to fail at if my teacher didn't help me out throughout it, but I was too distracted wanting to make music. There's not too much to say about this track other than it's one of the weaker ones in the album. It doesn't really have the momentum that it needed to have. Artists like Son Holo were like really big inspirations for me, but also he did it a lot better. I like really long drawn out chords with really long drawn out subs, and you need really good drums and momentum or a good lead to carry that weight of the whole track, not just kicks and snares. Albums in my mind are a lot better felt when they have a natural progression of song placement. Usually in the second track, it's supposed to be, an attention grabber. This isn't something I disagree with. Take the second track of a lot of your favorite albums and put them in like track 7 or whatever. I don't think they'd work. I don't think Artificial Dances does that rule justice. As much as I wanted it to be at the time, I think it's just kind of a really disappointing beginning to an album. It's still an okay track, just not something that I'd ever make again. I do like the little bridge though. I used to grab like free vocals. I think I'd just type like just free vocals in B minor and I just nab whatever. Throughout the album, I had curated a small amount of demos. It's like a little over 30 and probably some that I couldn't find outside of what I was creating in. I also put it in my mind that I wanted to create with several different people on this album. I wanted to flesh out different names, put different tastes in there, get different perspectives on this grand idea. Seceventh was somebody who I had worked with super early into producing. Like, I think he was one of the first remixes I made. I don't remember when exactly I threw the offer to him to work on me with a song, but with most people on the rest of the album, I throw them the demos first. Somehow he threw me a demo first, and I had really liked what he was throwing at me. There's a track called E8 that he was working on, and it's not too different from the final product, but it was definitely, the second part was pretty much the same, so I wanted to do something different. The first part was different, where he had a square bass instead of the noisy neuro-ish bass that I had. That's not too different. What's different is I had scrapped the second part and added a epic finale, again inspired by works by San Holo and even What So Not's album. I believe it was Divide and Conquer when it came out, or whatever that album was that came out that year. Seceventh had originally called the song E8 because he's so inspired by mathematical shapes. It's still a shape that I can't really comprehend in my mind. I figured I'd just keep it there because it's so tangible with how the song sounds. Anyways, Seceventh is a very mathematical person. His music is great. I think you should check it out. He hasn't posted in a while. I hope you're doing okay if you see this. As for the second half, I feel like it's a bit of an overindulgence on my end. At the time, I was very against 4 on the floor rhythms unless you build to something, but I don't think I really hold on to that rule anymore. As long as you keep the rhythm interesting for 4 on the floor rhythms and at least add some variety, and I think you'll be all right. Other than that, I think the mastering is a little bit destructive in it. I used to just grab limiters, put it on the master and kind of call it like that. I was trying to be very deliberate with my mastering there, and I knew at the time that those exponential rhythms were clipping, but I guess I just kind of ignored it just because I didn't know how to resolve the problem, which is fine by me, honestly. It still sounds pretty good. I like the entire song still. I produced this album on an HP laptop. It was a really bad laptop, honestly. It's been with me since 2015. I turned it on today to try and get everything I can from the album, just all the projects and all that. I can't even load projects at a decent speed. It took forever to load all my old projects again. 30 demos is very small compared to all the stuff I've been working on recently, but it was very condensed, and it's why it's taken me so long to make another album. Kalt was an incredibly demanding track for the computer that I had. Before this album, I did my best to push out as much sound as possible. I used to just make like really intense heavy dubstep tracks that just eat at my CPU. If it goes past 100, it wouldn't play or load, or it just crash. So I wanted to dial it back a little bit for this album. Kalt kind of breaks this rule. It did push my computer pretty much almost to the breaking point. Not like previously Uncharted did, which I'll get to that some other time, but I still appreciate this track today. It's pretty crazy for how I was producing it at the time, for how quality I think it sounds now, besides some writing and mixing mistakes that I made, but I can get into that maybe later. Kalt is the German word for cold, and I felt it was appropriate for this track because there's no sense of warmth in it at all. The drums are really snappy and sharp, the lead's really snappy and sharp. Even the strings, just because they're written in mid-eye, just feel like they're devoid of human touch. The driving idea behind the entire song was me just flipping through samples and the little playback in Ableton, just because my computer wouldn't load fast enough. I think I went into Audacity and re-recorded it on the stereo mix and just pressed down on the direction just to see all the samples go through, and that little rhythm was created, and I thought that was pretty neat. That combined with Hawkins, I know I talked about that earlier this year, but where you take, I had some random free synth that I got online, and there were a bunch of presets on it that were a bunch of different sounds, and I just click through each of them, and then I'd edit a bunch of them in, and it was pretty cool for the little break that goes in the middle, and you can hear those chords better in that section rather than like I tried to bake them in for the second drop, but you can't really hear them as well because there's so much going on, and I think that's a little bit of a flaw in the track, but it still sounds pretty good to me, especially when I re-recorded it and sampled it with Ableton's little granular effects. I thought that sounded really special, like the track was pulling against itself or something. I don't know. My foot's falling asleep. Does that look weird? That look like a weird shot? I'm gonna pronounce this wrong, just so you know. Eleos was the Greek goddess and personification of forgiveness and mercy, something that's resonated with me at the time of writing the song. It was a happy coincidence that this album had a lot of orchestral instruments sprinkled throughout because this was pretty much the most grand sounding score I could have been able to accomplish at the time. That being said, there are some noticeable hiccups, mainly the fact that I was afraid to write in keys below G minor. This song was in E minor, and for pretty much all the songs that I were writing at the time, I'd write the bass in the home key or the 1, and I wouldn't really stray away from that. My only issue is that I was working with equipment that wouldn't register a sub bass below F. If I were to play the lowest E that I could, it wouldn't really register, but that's not really how sub works. The goal should have been to write a bass line that accompanies the chords they're best playing with. Duh. So instead of committing to writing my bass in a low E, I decided to bring it up an octave. So instead of it sounding like a nice low accompaniment to this grand score, it's really like, it just doesn't sound right to me. It's kind of like dainty, like old mixes that wrote bass in higher notes. We now have technology that can push this bass out more, and even then, bass written lower than F still drives the mix in a certain way. It creates warmth to where I can explain in another video. It's okay. I'm losing light here. When this was brought into mastering, like I said, I used to just push limiters, and the only thing I knew about compressors were OTT and sidechain compression, so it didn't support my mastering at all. I pretty much just called it a day at that, though, and it still sounds like an okay track. Despite what I've said, it has some personal sentimental value. My intention with this album wasn't just to get you to hear a story. I also wanted the listener to come up with conclusions on their own. Based on the natural momentum of this album, I feel like you could come up with an arc all on its own, something that establishes itself, creates tension and action through its own certain arcs, has a low period and a point of redemption and climax until it reaches a mostly satisfying conclusion. At least that's what my intention was at the time. If you feel like this isn't the case, that's also a fair judgment. My favorite art just happens to be flexible in how you interpret and understand it. Mount Eleos transitions really clumsily into the next track for me, a jump from E minor to G minor with no real satisfying resolve of any kind. It's just kind of hidden behind some risers and drums. If I were to rewrite it, I'd probably either not do that altogether or just write a progression decent enough to stand on its own without drums. Leaves and Skyfall, however, is still one of my favorite tracks on the entire album. It's something that lacks decent transitions, but it comes from such a personal place that I can't help but revisit it time to time. This was written at 3 different moments during the fall of that year. The first part was on a plane flying back after I had gone through some really bad traumatic experiences. Future bass was still really big at the time. I wanted to write big filtered saw chords and the progression became just natural. Then I wrote some drums and pretty much just called it that. Flew back home and some time passed. And then the second part was written while I was going through a really particularly hard time. It was late at night one night, maybe like a month later. I was pretty much at an emotional rock bottom. And I wanted to write based on that feeling, and I think because of that, I neglected to write down transitions from the first part to the second. They both just kind of happen from one part to the next. But the same thing is true about the states in my life anyways, at that time at least. Another month later, I'd pretty much gotten my act together, figured some things out, and just managed to write the last part with hopes of looking towards the future. That whole song pretty much does feel like an arc from beginning to end, with a little less finesse than I would have liked at the time. In the context of the album, it works perfectly, just for that small little arc. It also helps that the ending feels like a departure from that certain era and also onto the next part of the album. I had asked my friend Moonside earlier in the year if he wanted to work on anything else with me. I'd sent him this demo sampling a song called Wildfire on my little stupid vinyl recorder. But it sounded completely different from what the final product was. He morphed it into this really cool sounding track. But also, I technically didn't have any part in making that besides sending him the sample. So I wanted to title it as his Interlude, asked for his permission, he said okay. He had also posted it before under a different name, but then I think he had a different song with the same name, so he just got rid of it. Or there's not much more to say other than I still look up to Moonside. He's such a great producer. His momentum in songs and his momentum in growing as a musician just has not stopped. All of his works have sounded great to me. It's just like raw talent. I really suggest you'd listen to him as well. There's also not much to say about Which Day, Yeah. As much as I'd like to come up with some gray and tail, it's just drum loops written over chords. It sounds good. People have said it's their favorite track of the album, which kind of is disparaging to me a little bit, but that's okay. It also serves as a nice breather to wind down before moving towards the next part, which to me sounds like its own little EP, because these next 3 songs to me feel like a mini EP of my former band Mile High Low Ends. It consisted of me, a bassist who went by the name Mhetic, and a guitarist who'd occasionally jump in on songs like 9 Days Suffered. These 3 songs to me feel like another mini story where the main character nearly meets his demise but claws his way back to finishing the story. And this song in particular came very naturally as I heard the guitarist play a simple arp on the guitar, and we just recorded that on 2 separate mics. Mhetic had some ideas to throw around, and we'd spend a good day or 2 just writing in my small setup in my room. You can even hear at the end where he'd envision how the song would play out in his head.
Alright, that's good. That's all we needed, because it's
Otherside, not to be confused with Otherside, and not to be confused with Otherside, was actually a track that was meant to be Mhetic's college final. He was just supposed to record a song that had specific check marks, and I believe he passed pretty good. A lot of people, including my grandma, told me that this track is pretty boring. That's okay with me. I mainly just like how the bass is carrying the whole song up until the end where those chords feel really satisfying. Shootouts was the big one me and Mhetic were both working on at the time of recording the album. I just wrote this Twilight Zone sounding arp and went with writing chords to it while he wrote a bass, and eventually got to a point where I just wanted to ramp things up at the end, and the rest just came natural, of course. Not much more to say about that other than I definitely could have mixed the actual instruments better at that time. I think I mostly just didn't want to mess with the natural sound the bass made. I still like those drums at the beginning a good bit. Back when I mixed basses, I used to just push the sub to a crazy amount just so that it could squash everything, because I liked really bassy sounding songs, but that's just not how mixing should be done. Thus Duality was a track I had previously released on SoundCloud, but I felt like I could do a lot more with it. So this is technically a VIP, but you wouldn't know that unless you looked on SoundCloud. And I don't even know if you can hear the original version on SoundCloud anymore, because I really don't give a shit about SoundCloud. I pretty much just took it and increased the tempo, replaced drums, and reworked the whole thing. And I think Thus Duality just came from there being two different drops, so it's duality. I don't know. It just works for what it is, and also that's also why I like people interpreting their own thing, because it just someone might have came up with something better for it. Not much to say about that besides I took a little field recorder while I was walking to lunch at school, and it was cold and it was snowy, and I was crunching through the snow, and I just recorded like me crunching through the snow and birds, and that's what you hear throughout the song, and I think that sounds pretty cool. I had also wrote down, this song can also be called Little Baby Boy Learns About Inversions for the First Time Ever. Always Around was a track that I had sent a really rough demo to Nostalgia Junkie for. It sounded nothing like the final version. Just a bass and some really weak drums, but when I got it back, he really turned it into this really awesome sounding demo, replaced the drums. And the only problem for me, which shouldn't really have been a problem, was that he transposed the song a semitone. And I think I was mainly just worried about that phase being off in the bass specifically, but retrospectively, I could probably just keep that key change if I were to write it today. It eventually turned more and more dramatic, and I made the decision to make it my conclusion for the album because it just fit perfectly. My flaws stand in that it's a bit too slow to reach its conclusion, and I should have been more confident in making the lead louder on the second part. But I really do enjoy those chords, and as an ending to my first album, I think it was one of the most perfect endings I could ask for. The artwork for the album has had different iterations. I had an idea of a hand being turned into a crystal to complement the story I had in my head. I'd asked my dad to draw concept art for it, but our schedules were kind of just all over the place. He had drew something, but I needed a fully fleshed out copy of it before the deadline, which was pretty much a week before the album came out, which was not a smart decision. Oh, the sun's about to close on my eyes. As a last minute attempt on making album art, I had this rock from when I went to Wyoming. They cut the rock in half. You can see the little whatever inside the geode. I just took a photo of that, and then I put it in the Photoshop and edited that around, and it ended up working really well. It left a lot of things up to interpretation. This album unfortunately did not receive attention upon release, nor really ever since, which dissuaded me from actually working on producing for a while, or even releasing a quality album like I should have been working on for more of these past few years. The issue with that mentality is that I had done no work to put myself out there. No shows to promote the album, no promotion in person or online, just a few scattered posts online just to people who didn't necessarily care what I was doing in the first place. It's embarrassing because when I quit my job at Walmart, I had actually told my manager that I was about to be doing something big after this first album came out. And looking back, it seemed to be, again, an embarrassing confession. I could have done a lot different with this album, much like I could have done a lot different with my life, but this was something I was still very proud of. I made an album. I always wanted to make an album. Not just music, but a project that had a beginning and an end and tells a story. And even if my first story was shady and messy, it was still something that I made and had a drive to accomplish. Looking forward and looking a little bit behind, this year, 2024, has taught me a lot about who I am as a producer and just as a person in general. And I just want to say I hope whoever's watching knows that I'm glad you're participating in who I am as a person. It's meant a lot just having views on these videos, like more than 100, but I've gotten to like a couple thousand, and that's like the coolest fucking thing ever. I'm beyond happy that I can grow alongside you and make the stuff that I've always dreamed of making, like since I was fucking 6. So to that, I just want to say, have a Merry Christmas, and remember that I am always around.